Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. As I said, we've had quite a good response for this, and I'm sure some extra people are going to be joining as now that we've started. So tonight, I'm going to run through the changes in the new racing rules of sailing, and I'm focusing really on those changes which affect race management. And I'm aiming this at people who've got race officer experience already, rather than complete newcomers. So just some of the changes are really quite, I'll call, visible, and other changes in the rules are more subtle. And as I go along, I'll be making some reference to the yacht club, Royal Hong Kong Yacht Club sailing instructions, but these examples should be useful for the other clubs who are joining us tonight as well. So we also have people from ABC and Hebe joining us tonight, so welcome to everyone. There's a reasonable amount to get through, and because we're not all in the same room like we would normally be, it would be helpful for me if we could keep any questions to the end, and I will try and get through them at the end. So if you have any questions, perhaps if you use the chat function on the Zoom screen, we can write them down, and Vivian is here with me just helping me manage the Zoom presentation tonight, so thank you to Vivian. And we are recording this session, so don't worry if you miss something. We will be putting the recording up on the Yacht Club seminar website under our seminar section, and I can send everyone that later. Okay. Right, so the new racing rules cover the period of 2021 to 24, and they went into effect on the 1st of January. So just as a bit of background, the rules are updated every 4 years and usually go into effect in the January after the Summer Olympics, to give the Olympic sailors and everyone else time to adjust to any changes before the next games. So even though the Olympics have been postponed, World Sailing decided to stick to the normal schedule and issue the new rules. So the changes to the rules have been made after over 200 what they call approved submissions to World Sailing, which have come in over the last 4 years. And on the race management side, there's been quite a focus on reducing the size of the notice of race and sailing instructions. Basically, if something is in the rule book, it doesn't need to be repeated in the notice of race and sailing instructions. And of course, already, even though the rules have only been issued for over a month, they've already found some typo mistakes. And there is the latest correct version up on the World Sailing website. Okay, so the Yacht Club standard sailing instructions were reissued in January, and they've been updated with regard to the new racing rules. And just as a small level of detail, we also have some new harbour courses added in there for those who sail race in the harbour. Okay, the changes can be basically divided into 4 different types. There are general changes, and then changes to race signals, definitions, and then specific rules. So I'm going to run through the changes in that order, and this is also the order that you'll find the rules in the new rule book. Okay, so one of the general changes, and these general changes basically occur throughout the new racing rules. So they're now using the word event instead of a regatta or a race. And an event can be a single race, for example, the Around the Island race, or it could be a series of races, for example, class championships. And this change was made about using the term event, because many of the rules actually apply to the whole event rather than just when boats are racing. So there are rules which apply on shore and after racing. For example, that famous Rule 69 misconduct. Okay. Another general change is that when they're referring to a rule, they're using the prefix RRS, Racing Rules of Sailing. And this makes it absolutely clear that the rule is part of the Racing Rules of Sailing, not any other rules which might apply to the event. For example, there's the Equipment Rule of Sailing. So that would be referred to as an ERS. But our racing rules, we refer to now RRS. Okay. Okay, and then some rule numbers have changed. Perhaps the rule has been moved to a different part of the rule book, or other rules have been inserted before. So it's important to make sure that you check all the rules that you're referring to. So your old sailing instructions might now refer to rules which have a different number. So one example is that racing rule 3 is now 4 and vice versa. And some of these changes have been made so that the rules appear in the book in the order that you would want to use them or refer to them. Okay, that's the general changes. Now on to some race signal changes. Okay, so now the orange flag has been actually added to the race signal section of the rule book. Before, this signal would have to be written in the sailing instructions for an event. Okay. And the rule defines that it's the staff, otherwise that's the fancy word for the flagpole, which is flying the orange flag that actually forms one end of the starting line. And so if you're the race officer, to sight the line, you'd stand behind the pole if you can and look along the starting line to the mark at the other end. And in Yacht Club, Royal Hong Kong Yacht Club racing, this is usually a mark with a white jacket at the pin end, but it could be looking down towards a flagpole with an orange flag on a committee boat at the other end of your line. Okay. And we've included the phrase, to alert boats that a race or sequence of races will begin soon, the orange starting line flag will be displayed with one sound at least 5 minutes before a warning signal is made. So this basically makes the display of the orange flag what we commonly call the attention signal. And the goal of this is to let the sailors know that a start sequence is beginning soon, so they've got time to get ready and to come over to the starting area and see what's happening. And this forms our instruction 6.3 in all of our standard sailing instructions. And again, a yacht club slight peculiarity is that some of our racing in the harbour starts at our onshore starters box. And here we don't use an orange flag on the starters box. Instead, it's that white pole with the yellow triangle that forms one end of the starting line. So with orange flag, there's no real change in our use of it, but the change is that it's now officially part of the race signals. And if you want to use it as an attention signal, you'd need to add that into your sailing instructions. Okay, so the meaning of the blue flag has changed. And before, if we look on the left, the blue flag simply meant that a committee boat was in position at the finishing line. So the blue flag could actually be flown anywhere on the finished boat. It only meant that the boat was in position at the finish line. So the finish boat would then normally fly an orange flag, which defined the end of the finish line. So that's what happened before, but now in the racing rules, it's the blue flag and the flagpole displaying the flag that forms one end of the finishing line. So that's where the race officer will stand to call the finishes, and no sound signal is needed when the blue flag is displayed. Okay, so the advantage of this is that you only now need one flag on the finish boat, so you just need the blue flag. And for the sailors, it will be really clear where the RO is going to be sighting the finish line. Okay, one more advantage, which some of you will have seen in practice at some of our races, is that we can now have a committee boat with a start on one side of the line and a finish line on the other. So this was typically not possible before because the orange flag defined both the start and the finish line. And now being able to have a start and finish on opposite sides of the committee boat can be very useful if we've got more than one class racing. So if you're the race officer, it means that you can get a start underway for one class while maybe you're waiting for the stragglers of another class to finish. But of course, you have to take care that the boats starting and the boats finishing won't get in each other's way. So you have to hold that quite carefully, but it does mean you can turn around races maybe a little bit faster than before. So just a general question. Do we now need to display a blue flag if we're shortening a course? So I'm asking myself that question. The answer is no. So the use of the S flag and Rule 32.2, which is the shortening course, have not been changed in the new rules. And 32.2 actually defines the shortened course finishing line. So if you were shortening course at a rounding mark, the flagpole with the S flag forms one end of that shortened course finish line. So you only need the S flag to define the finishing line. No blue flag is needed as well. And of course, remember, if you're shortening course only for one class, then you would fly the S flag over that class's flag. Okay, so nothing new, but just a reminder that we still only need the S when we're shortening course, possibly also a class flag. Have a drink. Okay, so there's a new flag added in the race signals. This is a safety flag, the V flag, and they've also added a new rule, Rule 37. So what do these mean? Rule 37, when the V flag is displayed with one long sound signal, all boats become basically part of the safety fleet. So if you're the race officer and you're worried about a safety issue, maybe the wind's increased and you've got lots of boats capsized or in trouble on the course, you can display V with one long sound. And that basically asks all boats racing and any officials and support safety boats to listen to the race committee VHF channel and be ready to help with any search and rescue. So all boats on the course, be they sailors, safety boats, coach boats, now form part of the safety resources available to help you. Now the V flag was often included in the sailing instructions for larger regattas, for example, Hong Kong Race Week, but now it's been included in the racing rules, so it's a standard safety flag for all racing. Okay, and don't forget, it's really even more important now to define the race committee VHF channel in the sailing instructions and also in your daily briefings to your team and the sailors, etc. Okay, now we're moving on to definitions. So this is quite an interesting change, and affects the race officers and the sailors pretty much equally. So the definition of the start has changed. So if you notice in the top definition, I've highlighted the words crew and equipment because they have now been removed from the definition. So a boat now starts when her hull crosses the line, okay? So the race officer will now judge if a boat is OCS based solely on the position of her hull, and the position of her crew, sails, equipment, anything else doesn't matter. It used to matter, it now doesn't, it's just the hull. Okay. And similarly, crew and equipment has been removed from the definition of a finish. Okay, so the RO will now call a boat finished when her hull crosses the line. Nothing else counts, it's the hull. So this begs the question, what is the hull? You think it's pretty obvious until you suddenly have to be calling a start line based on it. So what the recommendation is that the definition of a hull, which is in the equipment rules, is the definition to follow. Okay, and I've got that definition on the screen there. Okay, and what's important is that bowsprits, fixed or retractable, and anything else attached to the hull is not part of the hull, and so now cannot be used to call a start or a finish. Okay, so bowsprits don't count anymore in calling a start or a finish. And just to see what that actually looks like, this is one of the pictures in the equipment rules under the hull section. So you can see the rudder won't count, the bowsprit won't count, the safety rail doesn't count. It's the forwardmost part of the hull that counts at the start. Okay, so what does this look like now for us in real life? So before, the RO would look at the bowsprit of these boats to determine if they were over at the start. And if you look at the bowsprit of the white boat, Jubilee, you can see that it's actually really hard to see that against the hull of the blue boat, but they are behind, so it doesn't matter so much. But then if you look at the bowsprit of the blue boat, H30, imagine if you were on a long start line and that boat was at the far end, how hard it would be to see that dark, small, relatively small bowsprit. Okay, so now you'd be calling it based on the hull. So that should be much easier to see, hopefully. That's the plan. Okay, and then we look at the finish. So before, if the spinnaker was in front of everything else, the boat would finish when their spinnaker broke the line. Okay, but now it's when the hull breaks the line. Hopefully that is going to be easy to see, but if your line of sight is blocked, it might become tricky. But that's what you have to base the finish on as best you can now. Okay. All right, another definition, a definition of a mark. Okay, this is quite a subtle change. If we look at the old definition, it says about an anchor line or an object attached accidentally is not part of a mark. So that implied that an object attached on purpose is part of the mark. All right. That now, if you look at the new definition, it's been stated more clearly. So it's there in black and white, or in this case, or sort of red, an object intentionally attached to a mark, okay, forms part of the mark. So an example of this, if you were to tie a rib to a mark for some reason, maybe you were trying to signal a shortened course or whatever, the rib has been attached intentionally to the mark and becomes part of the mark. Or if you were to tie a float to the start boat, the float becomes part of that start boat mark. Okay. So hopefully it's a little more user-friendly now, the change. Okay. Obstruction. So the definition of an obstruction has now been changed so that the sailing instructions can designate any object or a line as an obstruction. So quite often we might have seen in the past that the start and finish line was included as an obstruction in the sailing instructions. You know, boat shall not cross this during a race. But technically this wasn't correct, as it altered the definition of an obstruction, and sailing instructions can't change that sort of definition. So again, this is quite sort of technical, but this change now allows the sailing instructions to specify a line, like the start or finish, as an obstruction in the course. Okay. Right. A new definition has been added. This is sailed course. So this includes the wording which we used to call the string rule in old rule 28.2. And why have they added this new definition? Well, the phrase sail the course appeared many times in the racing rules. So they now clearly define it so that every time it's used, it means the same thing. And if we look at B, it talks about each mark designated in the sailing instructions to be a rounding mark. So that now makes it clear that the sailing instructions have to include rounding mark descriptions. Okay. Now, we have, as this new definition, sail the course, there's now a new scoring that the race committee can do, which is NSC did not sail the course. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, the preamble, that's just the introduction to part 2, has been changed. So here we're moving on now to specific numbered rules. And again, I'm going to be focusing on the race management rather than the boat on boat side of things. And it's changes for race management on the water and onshore, and perhaps in the racing documents, these sailing instructions in NOR. Okay. So this change to the preamble of part 2 is often used in the offshore races. And the introduction is now changed with how you can replace the rules in part 2 with the RHKYC rules. RHKYC, it's the international regulation for preventing collisions at sea rules, which apply all over the world. So before, the sailing instructions would have to specify when the RHKYC replaced part 2. Now, this has to be done in the notice of race. And this change has been done in order to give sailors more time to anticipate and to get used to the changes in rules that they might have to follow during the race. Okay. Okay, 25.1. This is all to do with the notice of race and sailing instructions. And before, there's an increasing emphasis on the importance of the notice of race in the new rules. And this is because the notice of race is basically the invitation to the competitors. And it's also the contract of the organising authority with them. So the notice of race should contain any rules which might help a sailor to decide whether they wanted to enter the event, and also the rules they might not need to follow before racing starts, as well as any other information they might need before the sailing instructions are available. So this change is pretty common sense. You know, the notice of race shall be available to each boat before she enters. Okay, so pretty common sense change on that one. Okay, so 28, rule 28, sailing the race. This used to be called sailing the course. And as I mentioned before, the string rule, which was in the old 28.2, has now been moved to the definition of sail the course. So it's been removed from rule 28. If we look at the new rule at the bottom, a boat shall start, sail the course, and then finish. So they've inserted the word then, and this just clarifies that you have to start, sail the race, and then finish in that order to take part in a race. Obviously, they've had people argue that they did something in a different order and should get a result, but they've now made it very clear that you shall start, then sail the course, and then finish. Okay. If we look at the old rule there, I've highlighted described in the sailing instructions. So that phrase has now been deleted. And this is just making one part of the rules match the other part, because if we look at Racing Rule 27.1, the race committee can actually designate a course before the warning signal if a course hasn't been included in the sailing instructions. Now, we don't often do that in Hong Kong, but it's an option that's available to the race committee if there's no course in the sailing instructions. And just the deletion of described in the sailing instructions just tidies that the rule book up on that point. Okay. So I apologize if I'm going fairly fast. So this is going to be recorded, and there'll be a time at your leisure to go back through with the rule book and see if my explanations are making sense. Okay. Okay. 29.1, individual recall, and 30, which are all the various starting penalties. Okay. As there is a change to the definition of the start, i.e. it's only the hull now, this also has been changed in the individual recall and starting penalty rules. So for these, it's only the hull that matters. And so that's for your individual recall, and your rule 30 is your I flag, U flag, black flag. So it's the position of the hull that matters, not where the crew, sails, or other equipment are relative to the line. So it's the hull that will determine whether you're OCS or if the race officer thinks that you are in the triangle. And from the race officer's point of view, you're looking at the hulls only, not anything else that's going on in the boat. Okay. Okay, so rule 32 and 35, they've both had the word race added before time limit in the rule. Before they just mentioned a time limit. Now it's the race time limit. So it's just a clarification that the time limit they're referring to is the race time limit and not the any other time limit, Mark 1 time limit or finish time limit and things like that. So again, it's just a clarification and a tightening up of the rule. Okay. 33 and 34. So the phrase "while boats are racing" has been added to both of these rules. So 33 is all about changing the next leg of the course, and 34 is what the race committee does when there's a mark missing. And both of these rules require the race committee to do something. So race 33, you're changing course, you need to display C flag with repeated sounds. And if there's a mark missing, you have to display an M flag with repeated sounds if a boat is replacing or is standing in for a missing mark. So they've added in that these actions are needed if you're changing course or dealing with a missing mark during a race. So pretty obvious. If it was between races, you wouldn't be signaling a change of course or a mark missing, you'd just be moving them and replacing them. But during a race, it's just very clear now that you do the C flag or the M flag during a race, not between races. Again, pretty common sense, but they've obviously had complaints about that in the past. Okay, so rule 40. So the rule looks quite different in the new rule book. It's basically been reorganized, and they've given the power to turn on the PFD rule in the notice of race or sailing instructions. So for example, a notice of race, probably number about 11.2 might just say that racing rule 40.1 shall apply at all times whilst afloat. So some classes always require that. So you now can do that in the notice of race or sailing instructions. And if the Y flag is displayed with a sound signal, afloat, and that needs to be put up by the warning signal. So if you decide that conditions are worsening and you want to still carry on racing, but have competitors put on their life jackets, you can put up the Y flag with a sound before or with the warning signal. And that means that all the sailors have to wear PFD while they're racing in that specific race. Obviously, if you keep the flag flying, they have to continue to wear the life jacket in subsequent races. But if you put the Y flag up now with one sound signal on the shore, you can require the sailors to wear a PFD at all times when they're on the water that day. So afloat, it turns the life jacket requirement on for a specific race, and on shore with a sound that's new, they have to wear the life jacket all day. Okay, so rule 43, RRS 43. It's called exoneration. This was previously rule 21. And they've basically pulled together exoneration provisions which were scattered around in various different rules before. The major change in the rule is that if a boat is forced to break a rule by another boat which is breaking a rule, the first boat is exonerated then and there and doesn't need to take penalty. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into all the boat-on-boat situations where that might get triggered, but I'm looking at what does this mean for us, the race committee. So extra care now needs to be taken before you protest a boat for hitting a mark and not doing a turn. If the boat was by herself and hit the mark and didn't do a turn, and was witnessed by the race committee, then it's clear you can protest them for hitting the mark. But if other boats were in the area, was another boat involved in an incident which forced the boat to hit the mark? And was that other boat breaking a rule at the time? Now, this might be quite hard for the race committee to determine. So it makes the case about protesting a boat for hitting a mark a little bit more difficult. And of course, if other boats were around at the time, sailing is a self-policing sport. So ideally the boats should be the ones protesting a boat for hitting a mark or for something else, okay? So it's a slight complication for us that if there were lots of boats involved and someone hits the mark and we witness it, was that boat that hit the mark actually exonerated by the change rule to 43? So just something to take care over. And also just to note that 43 is one of the rules that cannot be changed in the notice of race or sailing instructions. There's a whole list of those rules which cannot be changed, they're all included in the rule 86.1a. Okay. 1 and 2 turn penalties. So if a boat has to take penalty turns at or near the finishing line, once she's completed her penalty, only her hull needs to be on the course side of the line before she finishes. Okay, this is all linked back to the change in the definition of finish. So if you're watching boat do turns, she needs to get her hull completely clear onto the course side of the line and then turn back up and break the line with part of her hull. So it's the hull, again, not the crew, sails, or equipment that counts on her clearing the line and then refinishing. Okay, World Sailing wearing their sustainability hat has increased the trash disposal rule. So this used to be rule 55, it's now 47. And it's including support people in the rule. So support people, coaches, parents, whoever, they also shall not put rubbish in the water, okay? And again, sorry, not again, but this rule also is now added to the list of rules that cannot be changed by the notice of race or sailing instructions. So the rule will always apply. Okay, definitely gonna have a drink before this one. So, rule 48.2, limitations on crew, equipment and crew. The title doesn't really tell you too much about what the rule means from a race management point of view, but I'll try and explain. So it used to be 47.2. So before, if someone fell overboard, they needed to be back on the boat before the boat resumed racing. Now, they simply have to be in contact with the boat before the crew starts sailing towards the next mark, which could be the finish. Okay, so I'll just repeat that. Before, everyone had to be back on board before the boat continued racing. Now, if someone's in the water, they can be touching a part of the boat, it could be the hull, could be a main sheet, before the crew restarts sailing the boat to the next mark. Right, so what does this actually mean for the race committee? So if you imagine a boat has capsized near the finish line and the crew are in the water and separated from the boat, the capsized boat drifts over the finishing line. She will then finish when her hull breaks the line. Okay, so the boat was capsized, so it wasn't sailing, and her hull has broken the finish line, and so that boat has technically finished, even though the crew are in the water. Okay, if we think about the boat has capsized near the finish and the boat is righted, and there's a crew member on board who starts sailing the boat towards the finish. But one crew member is still in the water, but holding on to the boat as she crosses the line. So that's okay, the boat will get a finish. But if the crew in the water lets go before the boat's hull crosses the line, that's not okay, and the boat will not have finished. They need to go back and at least get the crew back in contact with their boat before they then sail the boat over the line. Now, one extra consideration or complication perhaps is that some class rules, which are rules under the racing rules, require crew to be on board when racing, or sorry, require a specific number of crew or all crew to be on board. So an example is the Flying 15 class rules, which say that there should be 2 persons on board when racing. So for the Flying 15 class rules, if one of the crew's in the water, even though they're holding on, they're not on board. So the boat then can't carry on racing. So this rule change has sparked quite some debate in sort of race management and jury circles, even though the changes were made with the intention to help clear up these debates. What I would recommend, if you are faced with, you're the race officer and you're faced with a situation of a boat capsizing or someone falling overboard near the finish, that every time that boat's hull crosses the finish line, you make a note of it and the time, and also try to take photos or video. You then should have enough information to award them the correct finish. So you might not be able to make up your mind directly on the spot, but if you capture when they crossed the line and what was happening at that time, you'll then be able to give them the proper finish. And of course, if people are overboard and being dragged over the finish line, check they're okay. That's, safety is number one. Okay, I'm sure we might get some questions on that later. Okay, we're getting through this. In part 5, that's all to do with protests. The traditional protest form is now replaced by a hearing request form and a hearing decision form. Now, these are supposed to be available on the World Sailing website. I can't find them. I've asked someone on the race management committee at World Sailing to help me locate them. They may still be drafting them, I'm not sure. But basically, I've seen a site of a draft, and the hearing request form looks pretty much like the front page of our protest form. So, and that would be used by the protestor. And the hearing decision form looks pretty much like the back page of the protest form. So they've gone from 1 piece of paper to 2. Not quite sure why, but let's see. But of course, remember that the rules in the past and currently don't actually need any specific form to be used. As long as you've got all the relevant details and you've lodged it in time, a protest or a request for redress could be made in writing on anything, like a Peroni beer mat or a slightly soggy, crumpled piece of paper. Okay. Okay. So rule 60.2. Before, the race committee were quite constrained in who they could protest. They've now, under the new rules, the race committee can now give a report to the protest committee that they believe a support person has broken a rule. So the race committee can't directly protest a support person, maybe a coach or whatever, but they can put a report to the protest committee, and the protest committee now has to follow that up, and they may open a hearing. I mean, hopefully this isn't something that we'll start doing in club racing, but the race committee is now empowered to protest coaches or other support people. So not protest, but report to the protest committee to follow up. Okay. Okay, 61.1b, protest requirements informing the protestee. So now the race committee can simply put a notice on the official notice board to let a boat know that they're being protested. And if the protest by the race committee is a result of them seeing something in the racing area, this notice has to go up within the protest time limit. So what this means for the race committee is now we don't need to run around the boat park looking for a sailor that we're trying to protest to tell them that we're protesting them. So the onus will now be on the sailors to check the notice board to see if the race committee is protesting them. Okay. Scoring. So 90.3A. So I'm describing this as a subtle change of wording, and there's no real change in practice. Essentially, the low point system of scoring is the default system, as it always has been, unless the notice of race or sailing instructions specify a different scoring system. And they've just made this change to tighten up the rule book and not keep referring to the low point system. So the low point system is the default unless the notice of race or sailing instructions specify something else. So also under scoring, they've added a new clause that the race committee must make the scoring changes requested by the protest committee or the national authority after a hearing. So in practice, this was done anyway by the race committee. I mean, you'd be pretty silly not to make a scoring change if asked to, but now it's actually an official requirement in the rules. Okay. And they've added also clause E. Now, this addition allows the race organizers to effectively state an end to an event and to make results final. And the default time is 24 hours after the protest time limit or protest decisions being told or results are published. Okay. The notice of race can make that a different time limit. They could make it a week, 24 hours, 48 hours, etc. But basically the default is a 24-hour period in which any loose ends can be tied up and then the results are final. So this moves us from having provisional results still posted a year after an event. They can become final results after the time period has elapsed. But you are still, if you have one of those serious scoring changes as a result of a major appeal, maybe to the national authority or a Rule 69 hearing, those changes can still be made at any time. But all the other changes that might happen have to take place within 24 hours. That's the default. Okay. Now, I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about sailing the course. So now, if we look at the two, what was and what is now. So now, a boat that did not start, sail the course, or finish can get the race committee can give them a direct score without any hearing. So the change is that the race committee can now directly score a boat, NSC, if they didn't sail the course. So NSC, did not sail the course, is a new scoring abbreviation under in Rule A10, and no hearing is needed. So previously, the race committee would have to protest a boat if they hadn't sailed the correct course. So this change saves the race committee a lot of time at the end of the day's racing. So again, the onus will be on the boat to check and to see if they've been scored NSC, and if they think that that's incorrect, that boat will have to request redress. Now, just a word of caution on this. Please take care that the boat not sailing the proper course is, sorry, not sailing the course. Be careful with my words. Make sure the information you've received is robust. Ideally, the incident, they missed a mark, etc., should have been seen firsthand by the race committee. And if the report comes from another source, you can always investigate. You can always try and find out more. And if you're convinced it's a correct report, then you can make that scoring change. But if it's one of the other sailors who tells you that a boat didn't sail the course, there might be a conflict of interest happening. So just take care. And also, if a sailor saw another boat not sail a proper course, really they should be protesting that boat. Again, self-policing sport, okay? But if you're clear that a boat didn't sail the course, you simply score them NSC and have the evidence to hand in case they request redress. Now, NSC points are the same as a did not start, a did not finish, retired, or DSQ. So normally that's the number of entries plus 1. But if we look to 5.3, scores determined by race committee. This replaces the, used to be the old A9, and this applied to race scores in a series longer than a regatta. So with 5.3, a didn't start, an NSC, not sail the course, a DNF, a retired, or a DSQ boat would score points 1 more than the number of boats at the start of that race on that day. And DNC boats, those boats that didn't show up to the starting area, they would score the number of entries plus 1. So if your series was running over a month and you had 20 boats in total taking part, say on a specific race there were only 10 boats raced, if a boat got a DNS or NSC, they would score 10 plus 1. But any boat that didn't come out to the race at all, any DNC boat would get 20 plus 1, 21. So basically this is to encourage boats to show up for a day's racing when you've got a series running over several weekends. Now, change this option to score based on a day versus the difference between a DNC and a DNS, etc. This scoring option 5.3 has to be turned on in the notice of race or sailing instructions. It doesn't just apply automatically like it used to. Okay, and again, this would be very useful to turn this rule on for club racing series held over several weeks and months, which is quite common in Hong Kong. Okay. Now, this is my last slide. And it's all about Appendix J, K, and L, which all deal with the notice of race and sailing instructions. And basically, the introduction includes a statement that a rule in the NOR need not be repeated in the sailing instructions. And the aim is to keep the sailing instructions as succinct and unrepetitive as possible. So as I mentioned right at the beginning, the notice of race content should really include everything a competitor needs to know before making a decision to enter, and also the information on what they need to get ready before the event, whether they need to get some extra safety equipment or radio, etc. And it's obviously good practice to issue the notice of race early enough to give the sailors enough time to decide whether they want to enter. And the new rules have increased the importance of the NOR. And so sailors need to read the NOR carefully before entering and also before racing. So if we're working on the guideline that rules in the NOR are not repeated in the sailing instructions, they'll need to know both what's in the NOR and the sailing instructions. And the sailing instructions will have more of an event operation focus. So sailors and of course the race committee should have both documents at hand at an event and should know what's in them, okay? And then finally, the old notice of race and sailing instruction guides, which were in Appendix K and L in the old rule book, have been removed. and now are only available online at the World Sailing website. And they're now called KG, so that's the guide for Appendix K, and LG is the guide for Appendix 11. And by moving them online, the plan is that they can be updated whenever needed, rather than waiting for the 4-year cycle of publishing new rules. Okay, so a famous picture. Thank you for your time. We're just over the 7:30 mark. I think Vivian's going to, have you had any questions in the chat room, or?
We have got one comment by Leslie to all of you, saying that the judges and the umpire group in Hong Kong have the intention to send a Q&A to the World Sailing to clarify the rule 48.2. That's only a comment to all of you, not a question.
Okay, so just repeating that, that was a comment from Leslie, that the umpires and judges in a group in Hong Kong is planning to send a clarification, no, a Q&A to World Sailing about 48.2. That's the rule that's about boats, people being in the water, and whether a boat can finish or not finish, etc. So, as I said, that has sparked lots of debate, and we'll see what comes out from that. So, yeah, okay. Does anyone else have any questions? Do you want to unmute people, or?
I think they could unmute themselves.
Okay, are you able to unmute yourselves if you have a question?
Yeah, Fraser just unmute himself.
Okay. Fraser, have you got a question?
Hi, Brenda. No questions. I was just having a play with that. Thanks very much.
Okay, all right.
Very useful. Appreciate it.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? As I said, we've been recording this, and it will be going up on the Yacht Club website under our seminar page. Of course, if you think of anything later that you want to ask me, please feel free to send me an email. Okay.
We have got some thank you note from our participants, but
okay,
it seems that we don't have any questions.
Wow, no questions. Amazing. Okay, well, thank you everyone very much. And I just have one last slide. Bonnie, you're going to hate me for that, sorry. We were ROs together at the Hebe event on Halloween. So, as I said, all the new rules, lots of detail, whatever, but most important thing is go out there and have fun. All right. Okay. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Brenda. Great job.
Okay. Bye.